Thank you so much, guys. It's been a long while basically before I came back on this channel, but this is the Africa Climate Conversations, and I am at the Barotse floodplains in Zambia, in Western Zambia. So today I want us to talk about reintroducing Africanism in our conservation efforts. And today I'm super excited, and I'm going to let my guest introduce himself. Welcome to the show. This is the Africa Climate Conversations.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Glad to be here. And yeah, it's welcome to the Barotse. So my name is Machaya Chomba. I'm a conservationist slash researcher working. I've now been working on the Barotse floodplain close to 5 years for a conservation-based international NGO. Thank you.
Fantastic. What are we talking about when we talk about Africanism?
I think it's a very good question. I think from my experience or our experience working on the Barotse floodplain, I think when you talk about Africanism, I think it's really about appreciating certain fundamental values, but also identity of what makes us African. But obviously, I think there are certain knowledge frames, certain norms and values, but also identity of how Africans see certain social phenomena or issues, and also, if I can call them more of knowledge frames or systems that are drawn from our experiences, that are drawn from, for example, our rich heritage and culture, our experiences, but also, for example, how as Africa we translate knowledge from one generation to the other. But of course, it's a very complex concept. But of course, glad to talk about it with you.
Absolutely. Way back with our forefathers, do we have a situation in Africa or in Zambia whereby our forefathers used to allocate some specific piece of land specifically for conservation of wildlife?
Yeah, I think interestingly, conservation and utilization are linked. I think there's this notion where we've tended to separate the two in terms of conservation versus utilization. The two are linked, and when you look at them in terms of this coupled conservation and resource use, you think about, as Africans, I think we are very much being called the people who are very much linked with our environment, but also our resources. Whether it be, for example, for example, when we're growing, there's certain trees that are known, for example, to cure certain diseases, or for example, there's certain areas which are reserved for particular uses. So when you look at it from that perspective of how conservation and utilization are linked, Africa, I think, has got a particular role to play in informing conservation. But I think the problem comes in of how, I think, either because of colonialism or even post-colonialism, how we've tended out to decouple this, whereby as local communities you're told, listen, you can only manage, we'll conserve. And I think this mindset of how you decouple these, you almost even somehow disempower communities in terms of their ability to think of, listen, I'm utilizing, but also need to be mindful about conservation. When you decouple the two, that's where the problem then comes in. But of course, I think we've learned, and I think there are certain cultures in Africa, whether it be, for example, the Slozi people, the Lozi-speaking people in Barotse land, the Western Province, who at a very early stage really understood that to manage, also you need to utilize. For example, we know that there are kings of the Lozi-speaking people, Litungas, for example, Litunga Lewanika, and I think is one of the founding Litungas in the Lozi dynasty. And he did allocate a special area, which is then called the Liwa Plain National Park. The Liwa Plain National Park, Liwa then means this large expanse area. And you find that in the 1800s, the Lozi king, King Lewanika, had then set out this area because he recognized that, one, this area was special because, one, there were a lot of unique wildlife species in this area. And therefore, what he did then is that he identified certain people within his ranks who then were called lingombotis, or there's also another term where it means you're a caretaker of this resource. He then deployed these individuals drawn from all of Barotseland to go and sort of be stewards within this area. And this was important, Sophie, in the sense that you don't get a steward from one area. You get stewards from different areas, in a sense that you see it as a shared resource. And I think that whole thing about sharing communal resource is fundamental to conservation. And therefore, within this Lure then was almost his historical area for traditional hunting, traditional conservation, but communal utilization and conservation. And I think it's one of the very good examples of how Africans really thought about conservation.
Very interesting, because when you're speaking about the Lozi people, I'm actually thinking about the Agikuyu people of Kenya. You know, because there was an interesting aspect of sharing, and that communality, the aspect whereby if a river basically passed by your farm, all you needed to do was take what was enough, then let the other flow. The rest of resource flow to the downstream community. So, because today what you find essentially is that if a river passes by me, the first thing I want to do is dam the river and do the irrigation and be the one selling vegetables to everybody. But there was a sense of communality among many African traditional systems. But it was that aspect where there were taboos, there were rules. You wouldn't do this in a forest. You cannot do this in terms of a water body. When it came to forests, it was very interesting. The Agikuyu people believed that their god, or the god of our ancestors basically, lived in a holy mountain in Mount Kenya. They called it Kirinyaga. Because for them, with the snow and everything, they believed it was something magical. And there were, in terms of spiritual connection to that, because you find that the Agikuyu people believed in terms of specific trees were planted by God. And these trees were special and they couldn't be cut. And if you happen to cut one, there were rituals that actually were to be done. Talking about back here in the Lozi, in terms of why Africanism is really critical for ourselves as Africans in terms of conserving different biodiversity that we have.
And I think the example that you gave about the Kikuyu people is very similar, not only to the Lozi people, but even other knowledge, I think other peoples, whether they be in Nigeria or even in Zimbabwe, but also even in South Africa. For Zambia, particularly, I think for the Lozi-speaking people, there is, I think, this mythology, what's called the Lozi mythology. Essentially, there is this aspect of spiritualism, and how as Africans, or how the Lozi people see themselves, both in terms of creation and how they link obviously with the environment around them, which is also created. So according, for example, to the Lozi-speaking people, they have a deity who is called Nyambe. And the Lozi mythology goes with the notion that, for example, that Nyambe created man, Muntu, and gave him special or a stewardship role, which obviously very similar to I think the Christian. I think obviously there are similarities. And afterwards, I think the Lozi people then see themselves as descendants of Nyambe. And I think the building block in terms of how it links to the management of natural resources is that you have then the Litunga, who is called Kaungolo Kanyambe, who is then also seen as the representative of God, or Nyambe, here on earth. And you find that the building block of how, for example, the Litunga works, for example, with the various structures, whether, for example, the Indunas, Induna in charge of forestry, in charge of fisheries, in charge of water, and then you've also got other Indunas in charge of other social aspects of the Lozi people. So these building blocks all are founded on the fundamental belief of spiritualism and how humans, or the Lozi people, are connected to the environment, to the creation story of Nyambe and Lozi. And I think that's very important, I think, because when you look at it, and you did actually even say that with the aspect of Africanism in terms of communal sharing, there was also the aspect of responsibilities, because you're just not only, for example, benefiting, but you've also got some fundamental rights and responsibilities and duties in terms of how you manage natural resources. So, for example, in 1942, I think obviously when the colonial the British powers came, they noticed something, that, for example, the traditional beliefs, the laws-speaking people had certain ordinances or rules in terms of that you shouldn't cut a certain tree because it was fruit-bearing. And these fruits then were important in the farming periods. You shouldn't, for example, even cut maybe certain trees, for example, where birds sit. And so there are certain trees that were isolated to say, okay, these are important not only for food security but also to ecosystem functions. They documented that and then created what was called then the Barotse Forest Ordinances. So they became a sort of a basis for them to set up the forest management legislation that even, for example, informed the rest of Zambia in terms of how we manage natural resources. So it's really interesting that now what we're seeing is that spiritual aspect, the mythology and the building blocks for that was lost. Yeah. And what that means that you've also then lost certain pillars that inform how you manage the environment around you. And I think it's important, as you are saying, that we try to recognize this and how we push it back into our conservation space.
Because it's about recognizing that we, as human beings, we live in this environment. Whatever happens to this environment happens to us. And there's absolutely no way. We depend on this nature for food, for water, for air. And there's absolutely no way we can continue taking and taking and taking without letting it break. I remember when I was growing up, there was an aspect of minimal tillage. I remember we used to do a lot of terracing and stuff like that, depending on if you're living in a slope area or stuff. I remember the issue of, we used to also have, grow food in different areas. Like there's a way we would let that piece of land rest. So say, for example, if there's maize on this area, the next season, the short range season, you do maybe tomatoes or something like that. But you're not going to extensively, and we used to do manure. But I understand things have changed. Population has grown, the demand for food, like the whole thing of economy, like commercializing everything.
And I think that's very key, and I think that's very important, Sophie. And I think certain ideologies, because ideology inform economics, inform social order and so forth. And I think there are certain ideologies, and of course, the ideology of Ubuntu, for example, and I think is something that I think Africans can offer to the conservation space. How Ubuntu as an ideology sort of informs conservation. Unfortunately, and I think it goes back again to that decoupling of resource use and conservation. The ideologies now, for example, post-independence, that inform the resource use are mostly Western, that mostly inform, for example, like capitalism. I want to benefit. It's me to actually use and gain. And I think many researchers, like, for example, Eleanor Ostrom, who's written and studied indigenous communities and said, listen, there's something to learn about how communities utilize that resource. And I think that became then the building blocks for community-based and resource management. So you are right to say that I think there are certain ideologies, whether it be, for example, economic ideologies, how do you reintroduce that back? And I think the Ubuntu ideology, that's common for most of us, whether in Kenya or Zambia, and how to learn from that.
I think what I find, and I stand to be corrected, I find as if Africa is in a place where we are told what to do. And we seem to be, sometimes, I beg to be forgiven, but I'm like comfortable with that. We have all this indigenous knowledge. We're talking about nature-based solutions today. But what are the laws doing? Is that not nature-based solutions?
Exactly.
But we have this massive knowledge as African people. But I feel like we are comfortable in a way in terms of being told in terms of concept that are brought to us. And then we adopt them and we try to play catch up and try to do this nature-based solution now, try to do agroforestry, but it's something that our ancestral people did. Look, for example, for me, if you ask me where environmental degradation started, it started with colonialism. For my people, like the Agikuyu people, they used to believe that God, the deity, Gai Monenyaga, lived on Mount Kenya. And they have specific trees that were not cut. And there were rituals, or there were things that you're supposed to do before you cut these particular trees. So, wasn't that conservation? But when religion was introduced and the concept of Christianity was introduced, it came in a way whereby now God lives in a specific house. So what you need to do is go up that mountain, cut that particular tree, and then come with it, let's build. I remember Wangari Maathai is in her book, in her biography, she says very well, she went to school, and one of the things by the time she was living, they were still doing the concept of believing that God lives in a mountain. And actually that was still what was happening. But when she went to school, the big fig tree, it's one of the sacred trees, was actually cut. And so what happened when she came, the stream that ran of water that ran was emanating from this tree, had dried up, the tadpoles had died and everything. So you see the beginning. How do we need to go in terms of co-production, marrying the indigenous knowledge and all the scientific knowledge that we've actually gone to school and acquired, but knowing that we had something of value and we still have something of value in the rituals and traditions and the beliefs? How do we marry it together?
So in terms of, and it's very systematic, I think, how knowledge or these sort of frames, like what you said, nature-based solutions, or for example integrated water management, water security, all of these are paradigms that inform how, for example, we address social phenomena, or for example phenomena like for example forest loss or challenges to do with water management. So and this is something that Thomas Kuhn did actually write on, in terms of how this paradigm shifts, these interventions that come in terms of how we understand this problem and how we design solutions for that problem. So this shifts is something that I think he did write on. And in one of the papers that I wrote, I tried then to look at, for example, how these paradigms or these ways of understanding a problem and designing solutions are a link between three spheres. The first one is social, the societal frames or societal issues. The other one is science, and the other one is practice. So you find, for example, we've got society here, you've got science here, and then you've got practice. All of these are interacting to now produce what we call in paradigm shifts or paradigm frames. For example, nature-based solutions then is a mix of how society understands an issue, talks about an issue, cries about an issue, how science then responds to, for example, produce knowledge, and how practice then gets that knowledge and designs solutions to address a problem. Unfortunately, where we're missing it as Africans is on the co-production of that knowledge. That is responding to our societal issues and knowledge frames, and more of producing it to then inform the practice. You find that the science right now is really from one aspect, which is mostly informed by Western thought. And I think something that writers like, for example, like Henrietta Moore, she's written a lot about what's called the co-production of knowledge. Through, for example, and using culture as a reference point to produce knowledge. She talks about an example whereby, for example, she says that in most cases, knowledges or knowledge or interventions, we need to look at them as partial knowledge. So you get a piece of the puzzle, you go to the community and recreate a new knowledge using the societal frames, the cultural frames, to then have this sort of this piece of the puzzle or this ingredient with the communities and create a new knowledge that then speaks to, for example, the societal frames, and then sort of informs policy. And I think that's really, really important, that we start to take indigenous knowledge systems, cultural frames of understanding an issue, of understanding our own identity as Africans, and be confident about it. And I think it's something that you also agree with me. As Africans, we're scared to innovate. We're scared to create knowledge to actually address our issues. Yeah.
Why is that?
It's a very interesting question. Maybe, to be honest with you, I think it's the way that maybe I think Western thought of science has not really taken indigenous knowledge system very seriously in the co-production of knowledge. And I think because of that, I think we as Africans don't see, I think, ourselves as contributing properly to the co-production of knowledge. That we're not very confident in owning it, but also in contributing towards it. The ability that you're going to, the confidence that you're going to have in digesting a knowledge is whereby you feel like you contributed. It reflects your social frames. You will then be able then to recreate and be innovative with it. So if you're just given something, say, here, use it, you're going to be very delicate with it because you don't really understand how it was made, and you're afraid to, put it back and say, I think this
might break.
Yeah, it might, exactly. It may break, but that's then even what Henrietta Moores has called experimentation and co-producing of knowledge, and I think that's important.